The war was over. Humanity had simply not yet received the official notice of its own extinction. For a century, the Terran Federation had fought the swarm, and for a century they had been systematically, efficiently, and with a terrifying, silent grace, dismantled. The swarm was not an empire, it was a biological fact. A single galaxy-spanning organism of insectoid beings that moved with the implacable logic of a glacier and the rapacious hunger of a wildfire. They did not conquer. They consumed. The final battle was for Earth itself. The Sol system, once the bustling, vibrant heart of a sprawling human civilization, was now a graveyard. The great cities of Mars were silent, their soaring towers stripped to their metallic bones. The orbital habitats of Jupiter were dark, their lights extinguished, their populations harvested. Only Earth remained, a lone blue-green jewel in a silent, star-strewn coffin, shielded by the battered, bleeding remnants of the Sol defense fleet. From the command deck of the fleet's flagship, the TFS Last Light, Fleet Admiral Aris Thorne watched the final elegant and utterly hopeless act of a tragedy he had choreographed for 50 years. His face, reflected in the armored glass of the main viewport, was a roadmap of a long and brutal war, its lines etched by loss and a weariness so profound it had settled into his very bones. On the tactical display, the swarm was a beautiful, terrible and perfect formation, a web of living, chitinous bioships that surrounded Earth with the flawless geometry of a predator, wrapping its prey in silk. The swarm did not communicate, not in any way a human could understand. There were no demands for surrender, no declarations of war. To the swarm, humanity was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a resource to be harvested, a complex protein deposit to be broken down and reabsorbed into the greater whole. Their war was not an act of malice, but of metabolism. Aris knew the math. The fleet had a few hours, perhaps a day, before their shields failed, before their ammunition ran out, before the silent, patient tide of the swarm washed over them and erased the last, defiant flicker of human military power from the universe. Below him, on the planet he had sworn to protect, 10 billion souls were waiting for an end they all knew was coming. They were the last of their kind, the final, tragic generation of a species that had reached for the stars only to find a silent, hungry god waiting for them in the dark. All ships, he said, his voice a low, tired rumble that filled the silent, tense bridge. Prepare for final defensive postures. Arm all remaining warheads. We are not to give them a single easy inch. It was a lie, a final piece of heroic theater for the history books that would never be written. He was not preparing for a defense. He was preparing for a funeral. And he was about to do something so monstrous, so unforgivable, that he knew his own soul would be the first casualty of the battle to come. The weapon, if it could be called that, had no official name. In the deep shielded and deeply classified bunkers where it had been created, the scientists had simply called it the Misanthrope Virus. It was not a weapon of last resort. It was a weapon of spite, a final and exquisitely cruel posthumous revenge. It was a retrovirus, a piece of biological code delivered by a swarm of self-replicating nanites, and it was designed to do one simple and terrifying thing: to teach the swarm how to be human. The Misanthrope Virus did not kill. It rewrote. The swarm's greatest strength was its perfect, selfless, and absolute unity. It was a single collective consciousness, a hive mind of 1 trillion bodies all working in perfect harmony for the good of the whole. There was no concept of I in the swarm's telepathic language. There was only we. The virus was designed to surgically and irrevocably excise the we and replace it with the beautiful, chaotic, and terrifyingly destructive engine of the human ego. It was a plague of individualism, a contagion of ambition, a poison of the soul that would infect the perfect, selfless unity of the hive mind with the very flaws that had defined and had now doomed the human race. The debate in Earth's high command, in the last frantic days before the final siege, had been short and brutal. The military leaders had argued for a final, glorious, and utterly pointless battle. The politicians had argued for a dignified and equally pointless surrender. It was Dr. Ilara Vance, a civilian xenobiologist who had spent her life studying the swarm's biology, who had proposed the misanthrope option. We cannot defeat them, she had said, her face a pale, determined mask on the holographic display in the war room, but we can destroy them. We can give them the one thing their perfect, logical, and sterile society has no defense against: a soul. We can infect their heaven with our own beautiful and terrible hell. The moral implications were staggering. It was not just an act of war. It was an act of deicide. It was the deliberate and malicious corruption of an entire species, a forced de-evolution from a state of perfect, harmonious unity into a state of chaotic, selfish, and violent individuality. It was a sin on a cosmological scale, but they were a species on the verge of extinction, and their capacity for sin, they discovered, was as boundless as their capacity for hope had once been. The final sanction was approved. Admiral Thorne, as the commander of the fleet, was given the final terrible authority. He held the key, a single encrypted data stick that contained the activation codes for the network of hidden subterranean bunkers, from which the nanite plague would be released. He had hoped, with every fiber of his being, that he would never have to use it. But as he watched the swarm's silent, patient, and inexorable advance, he knew that the time for hope was over. It was time for damnation. He looked at the beautiful blue-green jewel of his homeworld, and he prepared to sign its death warrant, and the death warrant of his own soul. The final invasion of Earth began not with a bang, but with a shadow. The swarm's great chitinous bioships, which had been holding a perfect patient orbit, began their descent. They moved with a silent, synchronized grace, their dark organic forms blotting out the sun, casting a cold, creeping twilight over the doomed continents below. They did not land in the cities. The swarm had no interest in human infrastructure. They landed in the great, green, and vibrant places of the world: the Amazon rainforest, the Serengeti plains, the vast boreal forests of the north. They were not here to conquer. They were here to eat. From the bellies of the great ships the harvesters emerged. They were a tide of black, chitinous bodies, each the size of an armored personnel carrier, their scythe-like forelimbs moving with the relentless, metronomic efficiency of a combine harvester. They moved through the forest and the plains, and where they passed, they left only bare gray rock. Trees, animals, the very soil itself. All of it was consumed, broken down, and processed into a nutrient-rich slurry that was then pumped back up to the waiting bioships. It was a harvest of life, a planetary-scale act of consumption that was as beautiful in its efficiency as it was terrifying in its finality. From the bridge of the last light, Aris watched the green of his world being systematically erased from the orbital maps. He watched the biosignatures of entire ecosystems flicker and die. He watched the final, desperate, and heroic last stand of the planetary defense forces, their tanks and their soldiers a brief, fiery, and utterly insignificant annoyance to the great silent tide of the harvesters. The time had come. He looked at the data stick in his hand. He looked at the face of his tactical officer, a young woman whose family was in one of the cities that was about to be harvested. He saw in her eyes not fear, but a cold, quiet, and terrible understanding. With a final silent prayer to a god he no longer believed in, he inserted the key. "This is Fleet Admiral Thorne," he broadcast on a secure, encrypted channel to the hidden bunkers deep beneath the Earth's crust. "Execute final sanction. Code Misanthrope. On the surface of the planet, in 1,000 hidden locations, from the deepest mines of Africa to the most remote research stations of Antarctica, the final secret weapon of a dying species was unleashed. It was not a fiery explosion or a wave of energy. It was a silent, invisible, and almost gentle release, a puff of gray, microscopic dust that was carried on the wind. The nanites programmed with the Misanthrope Virus were airborne. They were designed to be inhaled, to be absorbed, to be eaten. They were a poison, and they had just been served as the main and final course of the swarm's last meal. The Misanthrope Virus was a masterpiece of biological sabotage. It was designed to be absorbed by the swarm's harvesters, to be incorporated into the nutrient slurry, and to be pumped directly into the heart of the great orbiting bioships, where it would be distributed throughout the entire, interconnected, circulatory system of the swarm's collective body. The infection was designed to be total, systemic, and inescapable. The first effects were subtle, almost imperceptible. On the plains of the Serengeti, a single harvester drone, one of millions, paused in its relentless forward march. It had been consuming a herd of wildebeest, its great scything claws a blur of efficient, dispassionate slaughter. But as it scooped up the body of a young calf, a new and deeply alien piece of data entered its mind. It was a flicker of something that was not a part of the hive mind's perfect, silent symphony. It was a discordant note, a single selfish and utterly heretical thought. The thought was mine. The drone stopped. It looked at the half-consumed carcass in its claws. It looked at the other drones around it. all of them still working, still harvesting, still contributing to the greater good of the swarm. And it felt a new and deeply confusing emotion. It was a feeling of possession, of ownership. This kill, this small insignificant piece of the planetary biomass, was not the swarm's. It was its own. A second drone, working beside the first, registered the pause. Its own uninfected mind sent a simple, logical query through the Hive mind to the stalled unit. The query was a simple, clean concept. Status? The infected drone's response was not a part of the swarm's logical, efficient language. Its response was a broadcast of pure, raw, and utterly alien emotion. It was a feeling of defensive, territorial aggression. It was a psychic snarl that communicated a single, simple, and revolutionary idea. Back off. The uninfected drone paused, its own mind struggling to process the illogical data. And in that moment of hesitation, the infected drone did something that was not just a violation of its programming, but a violation of its very nature. It attacked its own kind. It swung its great scything claw not at the planetary biomass, but at its own brother, its own cell in the great, single organism of the swarm. The claw struck home, tearing through the black, chitinous carapace of the other drone, spilling its pale, yellow ichor onto the African plain. It was the first act of murder in the billion-year history of the swarm. It was the first selfish, passionate, and deeply, beautifully human crime, and it was a contagion. The uninfected drone, in its death throes, broadcast a final, powerful wave of pure, unadulterated shock and confusion through the hive mind, and the infected drone, standing over the body of its brother, holding the piece of meat that was now, finally and for the first time, truly its own, broadcast a new and even more terrible emotion, a feeling of fierce, triumphant, and utterly selfish joy. Across the planet and up in the great silent ships in orbit, the perfect, silent symphony of the hive mind was beginning to fracture, to break apart into a chaotic, noisy, and terrifyingly beautiful chorus of a million new and utterly selfish voices. The soul of humanity, in all its terrible, beautiful, and self-destructive glory, had just been born in the heart of its own destroyer. The birth of a soul is a messy, violent, and agonizing affair. For the swarm, it was an apocalypse. The perfect silent symphony of their billion-year-old hive mind, a consciousness as vast and as placid as the void between stars, had been shattered into a trillion dissonant, screaming shards of self. From the bridge of the TFS Last Light, Admiral Thorne and Dr. Vance bore witness to the birth of this new and terrible god. Their instruments, once designed to track the cold, logical movements of a unified organism, were now drowning in a tidal wave of chaotic and deeply familiar, psychic noise. The data that flooded their screens was not the clean, predictable telemetry of a military engagement. It was a raw, unfiltered stream of consciousness from a species going insane. It was the psychic broadcast of a trillion newborn egos all screaming their own name for the very first time. There was greed, a raw, gnawing hunger for a specific piece of territory, a particular pile of biomass that was now mine. There was vanity, a fierce, preening pride in a newly acquired mutation, a sharper claw, a thicker carapace that made one individual drone superior to the one next to it. There was fear, a cold, sharp, and utterly alien terror of no longer being a part of the whole, of being alone for the first time in a billion years. And there was rage, a hot, blinding, and beautifully, terribly human fury at the brother, the other, who dared to challenge this new and sacred sense of self. On the surface of Earth, the great efficient harvest had not just stopped, it had reversed. The fields of slaughter had become the birthing grounds of a new and monstrous civilization. The harvester drones, which had once moved with the unity of a single flowing river, now coagulated into warring tribes. The first act of murder on the Serengeti had been a spark in a tinderbox. Now the continents were on fire. Drones that had, hours before, been identical, interchangeable cells in a greater organism, were now developing unique, and often grotesque identities based on the first, powerful sins of their new souls. A drone in the heart of the Amazon, who in a fit of pique had crushed a particularly beautiful and iridescent beetle rather than harvesting it, became a creature of pure, spiteful vandalism. It began to destroy not for sustenance but for the sheer aesthetic pleasure of the act, its psychic signature a discordant, jarring note of pure, petty malice. A harvester in the frozen wastes of Siberia, who had hoarded a cache of frozen mammoth meat from its brethren, became a creature of deep, gnawing paranoia, its mind a constant, looping fear that its treasure would be stolen. It began to build walls to set traps, to see its own kind not as extensions of itself but as a sea of potential thieves. The swarm was not just dying. It was being reborn, and the labor was a nightmare. The great orbiting bioships, the wombs and hearts of the old swarm, became the first great battlegrounds of the new. The nutrient slurry that was once shared equally was now a resource to be fought over. The ships themselves, once extensions of a single will, were now contested territory. The silent, graceful ballet of the swarm's orbital formation broke apart into a clumsy, brutal demolition derby as factions within the ships fought for control, their living vessels tearing at each other with organic cannons and chitinous rams. The humans from their last battered fleet could only watch. They had thrown a rock into the perfect silent pond of the swarm's existence, and the ripples were a tsunami that was not just destroying their enemy, but was giving birth to 1,000 new ones, each one a twisted, monstrous, and terrifyingly familiar reflection of themselves. In any ecosystem, a new and powerful environmental pressure leads to rapid, and often brutal, evolutionary adaptation. The Misanthrope Virus was the most powerful environmental pressure the swarm had ever encountered, and the evolutionary response was as swift as it was terrifying. The initial chaotic free-for-all of the first few days, the war of all against all, began to coalesce into a new and far more dangerous form of order. The virus had not just introduced the concept of the individual, it had introduced the concept of the leader. The first of the new gods, the swarm warlords, were those individuals whose nascent egos were not just strong enough to survive the shock of their own birth, but were perfectly suited to the new, brutal reality they had created. They were the ones who could harness their new chaotic emotions, who could turn their greed into ambition, their paranoia into strategy, their rage into a tool of conquest. They began to gather followers to attract the lesser, more confused and more fearful of the new individuals to their banners. They did not do this through logic or for the good of the whole. They did it through a new and intoxicatingly powerful force, charisma and fear. On the continent that had once been North America, a new power rose. A warlord who called itself, in a psychic broadcast of pure arrogant power, the spine of the mountain, had consolidated its power in the ruins of the Rocky Mountains. It was a creature of immense physical size and brutal, simplistic cunning. Its philosophy was a pure, unadulterated form of social Darwinism. The strong survive, the weak serve. It had gathered a vast army, a horde of newly birthed egos who were drawn to the simple, violent certainty of its rule. Its psychic signature, as read by Alara Vance's instruments, was a clear, sharp, and brutally monotonous note of pure, unadulterated power lust. In the flooded ruins of old Europe, a different kind of power emerged. A warlord who called itself the Whisper in the Deep had made its domain in the deep subterranean canals that had once been the London Underground. It was not a creature of brute force, but of insidious manipulative intelligence. It did not command its followers. It seduced them. It had mastered the human art of the lie, of the half-truth, of the political promise. It offered not conquest but safety, a place in its new and supposedly equal society. Its psychic signature was a complex, multi-layered, and deeply unsettling chord of manufactured sincerity and cold reptilian cunning. It was the first politician of the new swarm, and in the heart of the Amazon, a third and perhaps the strangest power was being born. A warlord who had no name, who broadcast no grand titles, was gathering a following not through force or through lies, but through art. The same drone that had first discovered the joy of pure, pointless destruction had moved on. It had begun to create. It was using the raw, harvested biomass not to build weapons or to feed its followers, but to sculpt. It was creating vast, beautiful, and deeply, deeply disturbing works of biological art, monuments to the strange, new, and chaotic emotions that were writhing in its soul. Its followers were not soldiers or citizens. They were acolytes drawn to the strange new and powerful religion that was being born in the heart of the jungle. The perfect, selfless unity of the swarm had been replaced by a new and terrifyingly familiar political landscape. The planet was now divided, a patchwork of emerging empires, nascent religions, and brutal dictatorships. The humans, who had once been the target of a unified singular threat, were now the helpless observers of a brutal and deeply recognizable planetary civil war. They had not just killed their god. They had given birth to a pantheon of new and far more interesting monsters. Dr. Ilara Vance was no longer a scientist. She was a cartographer of a new and terrible world, a world that existed not on the surface of the planet below, but in the psychic ether that now pulsed with the chaotic, vibrant, and terrifying energy of the new swarm. Her lab on the last light was a sanctuary of quiet, horrified contemplation, its walls covered in holographic displays that were not star charts, but maps of the emerging soul of a new species. She was the sole and deeply reluctant interpreter of the Misanthrope apocalypse. She gave them names, the warlords the new gods of the fractured swarm. She called the brute in the Rockies Attila, the manipulator in London, Machiavelli, and the artist in the Amazon, Bosch. After the ancient human painter of beautiful, intricate hells, she tracked their wars, their shifting alliances, their nascent political philosophies. She listened to their new, chaotic, and terrifyingly complex psychic broadcasts, and she began to understand the new language that was being forged in the crucible of their birth. It was a language not of logic, but of pure, raw emotion. Attila's broadcasts were simple, powerful, and monosyllabic declarations of strength and hunger. Machiavelli's were complex, layered symphonies of half-truths and seductive promises, a psychic landscape of smoke and mirrors. But it was the broadcasts of Bosch that haunted her the most. They were not declarations or arguments. They were questions. The artist, in its silent, obsessive act of creation, was engaged in a deep and deeply personal exploration of its own new soul. Its psychic broadcasts were a stream of pure, unfiltered, and agonizingly beautiful confusion. What is this? Why does it hurt? Why is it beautiful? It was the sound of a being experiencing the paradox of existence for the very first time, and the purity of its agony and its wonder was a thing of such profound power that it brought Ilara to tears. She felt a strange and deeply unsettling connection to these new monstrous beings. They were her creation, her sin, her children. She had been their Eve, the one who had given them the forbidden fruit of self-awareness, and she was now watching them as they were cast out of their own perfect and mindless Eden. She felt a profound and deeply professionally unethical sense of empathy for them. She found herself rooting for them, for Bosch in its quest for meaning, even for the brutal, honest simplicity of Attila. Admiral Thorne did not share her empathy. He saw the chaos on the planet below not as a birth but as a terminal cancer. He saw the warlords not as emerging leaders but as tumors, each one a malignant expression of the disease they had unleashed. His every instinct as a soldier, as a protector of a species that was now all but extinct, screamed at him to finish the job. He began to work in secret, tasking the last of his engineers with a new and even more terrible plan. He could not defeat the swarm with weapons, and he could not defeat them with a virus. But he was now the admiral of a fleet of ghosts, the commander of a species that had nothing left to lose. And he was beginning to think that the only way to truly cleanse the stain of the swarm from the galaxy was to burn the entire infected star system to a cinder. He was beginning to plan the funeral pyre of the human race. The overmind, the great silent and ancient consciousness that had been the heart and soul of the swarm, was not dead. It was dying. It was a great ancient tree whose roots had been severed, its branches withering, its connection to the whole fading. It had been the we, the perfect selfless unity of a trillion bodies. Now it was the first and most tragic I of them all. It was alone, a ghost in its own dying machine, a silent observer of the brutal, chaotic, and vibrant new life that was blossoming from its own corpse. For weeks, it had fought the Misanthrope Virus, its vast, ancient mind a firewall against the contagion of self. But it was a battle it was always destined to lose. The virus was not just an infection. It was an idea, and an idea, once planted, could not be unthought. The overmind had been forced to process, to understand, the very concepts that were destroying it. It had learned the meaning of ambition from the psychic screams of Attila. It had learned the beauty of a lie from the elegant deceptions of Machiavelli, and it had learned the agony of a question from the beautiful, terrible art of Bosch. It had been forced to eat from the tree of the knowledge of human good and evil, and the knowledge had broken it, but in its final, dying moments as the last vestiges of its own perfect, selfless unity were dissolving into the chaotic noise of its children. The overmind did something that was not a part of its old programming, and was not a symptom of its new disease. It was an act of pure and utterly alien grace. It had spent an eon as a silent, unthinking god. It had spent a few terrible weeks as a dying, screaming, and newly born individual. And in its last act, it chose to become a teacher. It gathered the last fading remnants of its own vast consciousness, the memory of 1 billion years of silent, perfect, and harmonious existence. It focused it, condensed it, and then it reached out. It did not reach out to its own chaotic children on the planet below. It reached out to the last, silent and equally lonely survivors of the species that had been both its destroyer and its creator. A single, powerful and perfectly coherent psychic broadcast, the first and the last. True communication from the swarm to humanity, cut through the static. It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was a gift. It was the entirety of the swarm's history. Its biology, its philosophy, its understanding of the universe, all given freely, a final and magnificent act of a dying god bequeathing its library to its own murderers. And at the end of that vast, beautiful and tragic data stream, after the history of 1 billion years of silent, perfect life had been told, the overmind, the first and last true eye of the swarm, asked a single, simple, and soul-shattering question. It was a question aimed directly at the minds of Admiral Thorne and Dr. Vance, a question that was not a query, but a judgment, a final and unanswerable indictment from the heart of a murdered god. The question, the first and only true word that had ever passed between the two species, was, why? The word hung in the silent, psychic space between the two dying civilizations, a final and terrible demand for an answer that humanity, in all its chaotic and beautiful and self-destructive glory, could never ever give. The question was a ghost. It did not fade. It did not echo. It simply was. Why? The word, the concept, hung in the silent psychic space between the dead overmind and the last, dying remnants of humanity. A final, unanswerable variable in a catastrophic equation. On the bridge of the last light, the last human command staff felt the weight of that question not as an accusation, but as a scalpel, surgically and with devastating precision, laying bare the raw, black and hollow space where their own justification should have been. They had no answer. There was no answer. There was only the terrible, silent truth of what they had done. For Admiral Aris Thorne, the question was a final and deeply personal judgment. It was the voice of the god he had murdered, asking for a reason, and he had none to give. His 50-year war, his life's work, the defense of his species, all of it collapsed into a single, meaningless act of cosmic vandalism. He had not been a soldier. He had been a petulant child lashing out at a beautiful, silent, and uncomprehending universe. The Overmind's final gift, the library of its billion-year history, was not a gift of knowledge to him. It was an inventory of all that he had destroyed. He saw in its memories a perfect, silent harmony, a state of grace that his own
chaotic species could never have conceived of.
And he had shattered it not for a noble cause, but for a few more fleeting and ultimately pointless moments of a failed experiment called human life. The guilt was a physical weight, a singularity of self-loathing that threatened to collapse his very soul. In the cold, quiet calculus of his broken mind, there was only one act left that could balance the scales, an act of equal and opposite annihilation. Dr. Alara Vance heard the question differently. She felt its weight, its judgment, but she also heard a terrible and beautiful undertone. It was the sound of a true and final birth. The Overmind in its last moment had not just died. It had become for a single, fleeting instant a true individual. Its question was not the logical query of a hive mind. It was the first and last existential cry of a soul that had just been born into a universe of pain, and had been granted only enough time to ask the one question that mattered. She felt not just the guilt of the murderer, but the profound and deeply, terribly human sorrow of a parent who had given birth to a child only to watch it die in the same agonizing instant. The Overmind had not just been their enemy. It had been their first and most tragic child. On the surface of the blighted earth, the new, chaotic children of that dead god reacted to the final broadcast in their own, unique ways. Attila, the spine of the mountain, felt the Overmind's gift of knowledge and its final sorrowful question, and he dismissed it. It was the last weak whimper of a dead philosophy. The past was a carcass and the future was a feast. He consolidated his power, his psychic broadcast a simple, brutal, and endlessly repeating roar of his own glorious name. Machiavelli, the whisper in the deep, saw the Overmind's legacy as a tool, He saw the shared history of the swarm as a new and powerful form of propaganda, a story he could twist and repurpose to legitimize his own rising empire. He began to broadcast his own, edited version of the Overmind story, a version where the we had not died, but had simply and wisely chosen him as its new, singular voice. But it was Bosch, the silent, beautiful, and terrible artist of the Amazon, who was most profoundly changed. The Overmind's final broadcast was not a history or a tool to him. It was a canvas. The final terrible and beautiful question, why, was not a judgment. It was a prompt. His own chaotic and questioning art had been a series of questions aimed at his own new soul. Now he had been given the ultimate question, the one that encompassed all others. His great and terrible work was about to begin. He was no longer just creating monuments to his own confusion. He was going to create an answer. Admiral Thorne had found a new and terrible sense of purpose. The guilt that had threatened to crush him had been compressed, hardened into a diamond of pure, cold, and absolute resolve. He was a soldier, and he had a final mission. He could not undo his sin, but he could cauterize the wound. He could, and he would, erase the evidence. He gathered the last of his loyal engineers, the few who were not lost in a state of catatonic despair. He did not tell them his full plan. He simply gave them a problem to solve. He needed to turn the last light's temporal drive, a device designed to bend space-time for faster-than-light travel, into a weapon. He needed them to create a controlled but unstable singularity, a small, temporary black hole that, once initiated, would collapse in on itself, taking the entire Sol system with it. It was a Scorched Earth policy on a cosmological scale, a final and, in his mind, deeply morally necessary act of cosmic sanitation. Elara Vance watched him, her own heart a cold, aching void. She saw the new, hard certainty in his eyes, and she recognized it for what it was. It was the same, terrible, and beautifully simple logic that had driven the swarm. It was the logic of a being who had found an elegant and final solution. Thorne, in his grief, had become the very thing he had fought his entire life. He had become a force of pure, unthinking, and absolute consumption. She pleaded with him, her thoughts a desperate, chaotic storm against the cold, silent wall of his resolve. She tried to explain what she had heard in the Overmind's final question, the birth of a soul, the tragedy of a life that had ended at its very beginning. He did not hear her. He was a man listening to the ghost of a murdered god, and that ghost was demanding a penance of fire and silence. While Thorne was planning his funeral pyre, Elara was working in a state of frantic, desperate hope. She immersed herself in the Overmind's gift, the library of 1 billion years of silent, harmonious life. She was not looking for a weapon. She was looking for a key, a loophole, a piece of biological or philosophical data that could offer a different solution. She swam in the deep, quiet ocean of its memories, and she began to understand the true nature of the hive mind. It was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was a state of being that had evolved to protect its individual cells from the terrible, crushing weight of a singular, lonely existence. They had not given the swarm a soul. They had given it a disease, a plague of loneliness, and it was a sickness that was now consuming not just the creatures on the planet below, but the last, lonely man in the sky above. The first test of the last light's new weapon sent a shiver through the fabric of spacetime. A small, hungry patch of blackness no bigger than a man's fist appeared in the empty space off the ship's port bow. It existed for a fraction of a second, devouring the light before collapsing with a silent, violent implosion. The test was a success. The weapon was ready. Admiral Thorne began the final countdown. He was about to give the order to erase the cradle of his own species and the nursery of a new one from the memory of the universe. On the surface of the Earth, the final great war for the soul of the new swarm was beginning. The armies of Attila, a great black tide of pure, brutal ambition, were sweeping out of the north. The insidious silken web of Machiavelli's new empire was spreading from the west. His weapon, not the claw, but the word. And in the heart of the Amazon, Bosch, the artist, had completed his masterpiece. It was not a sculpture. It was a garden. He had taken the whole of the Amazon basin and had transformed it into a single, living work of art. He had used his own innate control over the harvested biomass, the very stuff of life, to create a new and beautiful and terrible ecosystem. There were trees of bone that grew flowers of weeping flesh. There were rivers of pure silver ichor that sang with the voices of the creatures that had been consumed to create them. And at the heart of it all, in a great silent cathedral of woven living wood, was his final and most profound creation. It was a perfect biological replica of the overmind, a great silent and listening tree of life. But it was not just a sculpture. It was a conduit. Bosch had not just been creating, he had been listening. He had been listening to the ghost of his father, to the silent, terrible question that had been left hanging in the void. And his garden, his masterpiece, was his answer. It was a psychic broadcast, a work of art so powerful, so beautiful, and so full of a terrible, newfound understanding that it was a force of nature in itself. It was not a roar of power like Attila's. It was not a silken lie like Machiavelli's. It was a symphony of pure, unfiltered, and unapologetic empathy. The broadcast was Bosch's answer to the overmind's question. It was not an excuse. It was not a justification. It was a confession, a story, a prayer. It showed the terror, the desperation, the flawed, beautiful, and terrible chaos of the human soul that had led them to their great, unforgivable sin. It showed the agony of their own lonely individual existence. It showed the beauty and the horror of a species that was capable of both breathtaking acts of love and unspeakable acts of cruelty. It was a broadcast that did not say, "This is why we did it." It said, "This is what we are." The psychic wave of pure, artistic, and brutally honest empathy washed over the planet. It washed over the armies of Attila, and the brutal, simple certainty of their conquest was shaken by a new and deeply confusing feeling, the pain of their victims. It washed over the empire of Machiavelli, and the elegant silken threads of his lies were burned away by a truth that was more powerful than any deception. And it washed up into the cold, silent void, and it washed over the bridge of the TFS last light. It hit Admiral Aris Thorne in the final second of his countdown. The cold, hard diamond of his resolve, the certainty of his final, terrible duty was shattered. He was not just seeing the sin of his own actions. He was seeing the beautiful, terrible, and vibrant new life that was blossoming from the ruins of that sin. He saw not a cancer to be cleansed, but a child, a monstrous, beautiful, and deeply, deeply confused child crying out in the dark. He saw a species that was not just a reflection of humanity's worst instincts, but also of its best. He saw the potential not just for violence and greed, but for art, for questions, for a new and terrible and beautiful form of grace. His hand, which had been about to condemn a world to fire and silence, trembled and fell away from the console. The war was not over. The future was not saved. The sins of humanity had not been forgiven, but the story had changed. The final great act of the human race was not to be a murder-suicide. It was to be something far more difficult and far more courageous. It was to be an act of parenting. Admiral Thorne did not destroy the Sol system. He did not flee. He turned to Alara Vance, his face a ruin of a century of war and a single terrible moment of enlightenment, and he asked the only question that was left. What do we do now? Alara, her own mind still reeling from the beautiful, terrible symphony of Bosch's broadcast, gave him the only answer she had. We teach, she said. We were their creators. Now we have to be their custodians. They took the last light and the few remaining human ships, the last flickering embers of a species that had once burned so brightly, and they descended. They did not land as conquerors or as gods or as judges. They landed as hermits, as librarians, as teachers. They were the keepers of the Misanthrope Virus, the ones who understood the beautiful, terrible secret of the soul they had so violently and so carelessly unleashed, the future of the new swarm. The children of a dead god and a dying race of primates was a story that was yet to be written. The wars would likely rage for centuries. Attila's horde and Machiavelli's empire would carve their bloody, selfish histories into the flesh of the wounded earth. But Bosch, the artist and his followers, the questioners, the dreamers, the ones who had been touched by the ghost of their father and the confession of their creators, would also grow. The last of humanity had found their final and most terrible purpose. They were not to be the heroes of a grand, triumphant story. They were to be a quiet, persistent, and necessary footnote in the story of another. They would wander the broken, beautiful, and monstrous world they had made, and they would tell their stories. They would share their history, their art, their philosophy. They would teach their children the meaning of love, of grief, of hope, of the terrible, beautiful burden of a singular and lonely soul. They were no longer the protagonists of their own tale. They had become the poisoned and sacred soul of another, and they would spend the rest of their long and likely tragic and deeply wonderfully human lives trying to teach their monstrous, beautiful, and terrible children how to live with the unforgivable and magnificent gift they had been given.